So I'm Yoshi Shiraki, and thank you again for joining us today from Deals A to Z. We finished our last episodes of Fix and Flips. Today we kick off a new set of episodes on seller financing by interviewing seller financing experts. So I've got Geoff, my partner in crime, who's the real estate attorney, and Geoff Deering, who is the seller financing expert. So on that note, Geoff, thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yes. So if we could dive into this interview and share a little bit about how you found this particular seller finance transaction.
Well, yeah, on this particular one that I'm going to share today, it was actually a deal that was brought to me by a local wholesaler who had actually put it together.
Did the wholesaler structure the wholesaler financing end of this as well?
For the most part, there was some things that I had to come in and kind of reevaluate and redo after closing. There were some issues with the way things were structured that we had to come in and change a little bit. But for the most part, they had introduced the idea and put it together that way.
Okay. What was one of the major things that you actually redid after you closed? I find it interesting that you made changes after you closed.
Yeah, so I mean, not so much the structure as much as the payments. We set up
whether it's like escrow specialist.
Escrow specialist, yeah. We set up an account through them to make sure that the payments were distributed correctly.
Okay.
Rather than just going directly to the seller and making sure that everybody was covered. There was actually some issues that caused that to happen where the payment didn't get to the bank in time on a couple payments, and it actually dinged her credit. So I ended up actually setting up some credit repair services too to help with that. So
yeah, we'll talk about that in a second. That's great. We've actually had other guests on with problems, and those problems are great, not for you.
Well, yeah,
great learning experiences, and that's why we're
right.
here to teach others, from things that went on in our deals, and
right,
how
exactly
solve them. So you found it from a wholesaler. Tell us about what documents you got from the wholesaler. How did they approach you about it? What did you look at?
Well, like any normal deal, you run your comps, make sure that the price makes sense. Generally looking at the property, making sure that everything is up to par to what you're expecting. The next big thing was just examining the documentation on the buyer or the seller side on whether or not it was assignable for first thing for the contract, which this wholesaler knew what they were doing there, so that wasn't a big issue. And then just making sure that they had documents that wouldn't trigger the due on sale clause if filed with the state.
On this deal, there was an underlying mortgage.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Did you get any of the underlying mortgage documents, like a copy?
I did actually.
Good.
Yes, I looked at them very thoroughly. Yeah, I wanted to know how much she owed. I wanted to get updated statements as they came in. I actually had the owner change the mailing address for those statements to my mailing address, my P.O. box, so it wouldn't raise any suspicion to keep it in the same name.
Good. So you got a copy of the most recent mortgage statement.
Right.
That's key in a seller financing. That should be baseline first thing you ever do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
it tells you a lot of information, the current balance, whether they're in arrears, et cetera.
Right. Yeah, they're pretty thorough documents. Even with that little statement, you can tell quite a bit. So,
but you also got a copy of the note, and I can tell you that in a lot of seller finance deals, they don't get the note. The buyer doesn't.
Right. Yeah, the note's a little bit less likely to be gotten by a buyer, but it's on record, so it's not like it's hard to find.
You have to track it down. They may have to call the bank, put in a request, or something like that if they don't have it. And most owners don't have their note.
Yeah, they don't keep something like that on file. It's a big, thick document, hard to store somewhere.
Yeah,
I know I don't keep them for all my properties. I usually have
But how did you get a copy of the note?
It was actually a digital copy that they sent me in a PDF, so made it a little easier to transfer.
Okay.
So, but yeah, reviewed that, made sure there wasn't anything crazy aggressive for due on sale clauses, things like that.
Right.
Something
And
like
no variable rate note,
right,
no option arm.
right. It was a standard 30-year note. No craziness. Nothing like Utah housing where they get really aggressive if someone tries to do a subject to. So
And
yeah.
how far into the mortgage were they?
They were only about 3 years in, so it was still pretty early on. There was still a lot of interest to be written off, so that was good.
Right.
Um,
So can you explain how that makes a difference, especially in your analysis of seller finance deals when there's an underlying mortgage, where in that 30-year amortization they are?
yeah, I mean, early on, that's one of the benefits is the extra. I mean, for those who don't have a rudimentary understanding of amortization, the first 7 to 10 years are the highest amount of interest paid as you're paying down that loan. Not to get too complicated, but you're actually paying a lot more than the 5 or 6% that the loan may say if you calculate it correctly. But the long and short of it is all of that interest can be written off if done correctly, and it's a huge benefit for someone who's making income to be able to write off a lot of that income. So
Right. Yeah, and then later in the mortgage, each payment contributes more to principal, so you're actually paying
right,
down faster, which is also another benefit.
exactly, yeah,
But that's one of the things you need to investigate in a seller finance deal, and why you want a copy of it. At least that most recent mortgage statement, because it'll give you the origination date.
yeah,
You can
exactly,
determine
and
how far into that mortgage the buyer is or the seller is, and if you're later in it, and you're going to be paying down more equity with each payment, you can actually get deals in thinner margins. Because
right.
the equity growth is going to be much more substantial than early on in the mortgage.
Yeah, your equity growth is definitely much more substantial later on. So I'm seeing that now with properties that I bought 10 and 15 years ago. We're starting to get on the back end of the payments, and that equity is growing a lot quicker. So
Yeah.
Excellent. Geoff, if you don't mind me asking, how did you get introduced to the seller through the wholesaler? I always get asked that when doing wholesale transactions, because
yeah.
now this unknown individual gets introduced to the seller who's the end buyer when they thought the other person was the end buyer.
Well, having done a number of wholesale deals myself where I've offered seller finance on them, the best way I've found to tie those two together is to introduce them as a partner. So basically introduced as a partner buyer, someone who's coming in to assist them in the purchase. That way it didn't raise any red flags. We all seem to be part of the same team.
Perfect.
Did you meet them before closing, the sellers?
No. The wholesaler was pretty, and rightly so. They wanted to make sure that we were performing before we went into that. So
Right. And that's pretty standard in wholesale deals.
right,
Then you can wholesale a deal, but in a seller finance transaction and a wholesale deal, you, the buyer, and this I teach this all the time, in a seller finance transaction, you've got a long-term relationship with the seller.
absolutely, yeah. You don't want to burn that bridge, because it can come back to haunt you and give you some bad reviews later on in your company, which you definitely don't want.
So if you are picking up a seller financed wholesale deal, you'll need to work really closely with the wholesaler to make sure you get good contact information with those sellers.
Right.
Names, phone numbers, emails.
Right, and help them to build a good rapport with the buyer and the seller between the two. That way you can kind of step out of the position a little bit and still maintain it a little bit, but not nearly as much as in the beginning.
How often do you reach out to the seller just to communicate? Because I know another investor who had no idea that the seller moved to Atlanta. When he called the 801 Utah number, it didn't exist, had to track this person down to realize they were in another state.
Well, it really depends. I mean, if everything's set up, you've got an escrow account set up and everything's kind of working like clockwork, I'd go months without talking to them. There wasn't really any need to. I mean, I don't need their permission to sell anymore. I own the property.
Sure.
So for the most part, unless there's a major issue with the underlying mortgage, I don't have a reason to communicate with the previous owner.
Yeah. If everything's structured correctly and you have all the appropriate documents, hopefully you never need to speak with the sellers again.
Right.
Right.
You think in advance and you get, especially permission to get payoffs. Here's one that a lot of investors forget when they buy a seller finance deal, that at some point down the road, they're going to pay off the underlying mortgage, whether they sell the property or refinance it. And all banks are slightly different in what they require in order to provide that payoff.
Sure.
And some banks do require a written authorization from the seller. So if you don't get that in advance, you might have to be hunting down your sellers years down the road to get their permission to get the payoff.
Yeah, and that's actually one document I always acquire right at the first is an authorization to speak with the bank form.
Right.
I learned that the hard way when I was doing short sales earlier on in my career. That if you don't have that, you're not getting anywhere with the bank. So
you do
I
just
definitely do that.
like an authorization letter, an actual power of attorney.
Typically, it's just been a little authorization letter saying so-and-so and this entity have permission to speak in my behalf with the bank, something to that effect. Power of attorney, like a limited power of attorney for just that
Special
specific
limited power of attorney.
Right, wouldn't be a bad idea either. I mean, they essentially work the same way. Not being an attorney as you are, obviously, you know better than I do, but I'd say it's worked so far. So.
Do require the actual power of attorney.
Mm-hmm.
Most banks will accept just a letter, something signed by the seller that says this person has authorization. But there are a couple of banks out there that do ask for a power of attorney before.
Yeah, and in the dozens of deals I've done that way, both seller financing and short sales, I've never had a problem with anything but the form I get. So
good, and make sure you get that form. Okay, we've
absolutely imperative.
Talked about now already. You want a copy of the most recent mortgage statement. You want a copy of the note.
Right.
You want to get the borrowers, which is your sellers, authorization to speak to the bank in some fashion, whether it's just a note or a power of attorney. Okay, three very important documents so far.
Yep, and just getting their permission to, and all the documents signed to set up that escrow account was pretty imperative early on too, because as Yoshi said, they could disappear, and trying to track them down again, they may forget all about it depending on how long you go with it. So
and many do disappear. I see that all the time. They've sold their house and they think they're done and gone. They don't realize that this mortgage kind of hangs around for a while. Right.
And, most of the ones that I've sold on seller finance or bought on seller finance, it usually is only about a 3 to 5 year cycle.
What's your preference when you pick up a seller financing deal? I mean, there are investors that want like the full rest of the term of the underlying mortgage, like another 25 or 50 years. Do you look for that? Do you prefer shorters? What's your term on a seller transaction?
Honestly, nowadays I don't really do a lot of single family home investments for long term. So when I'm doing seller finance on single families, it's usually long enough to be able to rehab the property and resell it, or maybe a year or two. I'm good with that. Yeah. Now on the flip side, on like a bigger property like a storage unit facility or a apartment complex, and I've done those deals on seller finance as well. I'm looking for a longer term. One as long as term as I can get. So.
How long was the term on this deal that we're talking about today?
It was actually perpetual. Yeah, we could have kept it for another 27 years. I opted to sell it again because, again, it's not really my long-term desire to hold property. It was what I call a long-term flip. I kept it for a year and then sold it. So my capital gain was lower.
Gotcha. That's a good strategy, though.
Well, and that was the benefit too, is I just did a wrap and sold it again on seller finance to an end buyer. So
did you
have to pulled out my so I just backed out my equity and basically let them take over the note.
What do you think you saved in hard money costs?
Oh man. Well, so it was about a $250,000 property. So 2 points on that would be about $5,000 there. And then on the standard 12%, 1% a month, that's probably another $10,000. So at least $15,000.
Yeah.
There wouldn't have been any profit in the deal the way it was structured, it was pretty tight.
But I like it. It's an interesting take on flips. Especially we talk a lot about wholetailing,
Right.
picking it up, doing a quick paint and carpet. But if it's a good rental property, but you're not really interested in rental properties, you could actually hold it for a year.
Yeah, and that's what I did. I put a lease option tenant in it for a year, and when they didn't execute, I turned around and just sold it at retail, and made even more money. So
yeah, and you saved.
Market went up.
Saved considerably on taxes, in fact.
Yeah.
How was this deal structured? Did you use a note and deed, like an all-inclusive, or did you just subject to?
Yeah, it was an all-inclusive trust deed.
Okay.
So
you're not a lawyer, are you kind of competent to succeed?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of went with the obviously the structure of the wholesaler, and went with their title company, and when I closed it, we went through a different one, but yeah, we kind of went by there, and I felt pretty confident this particular group does a lot of wholesaling, and I think they know what they're doing. So
yeah, and I like the AITD route. Do you remember that when you bought it, did the sellers walk with any cash, or was now an all-inclusive note indeed is a wrap note? So it's a note, it's a mortgage that wraps around the current underlying mortgage. Was it the exact same terms as the underlying mortgage, or did you owe the sellers more on their all-inclusive note than they owed on the underlying mortgage? Do you remember?
I actually it was a simple assumption, basically. Yeah. Assuming it without assuming it, right? Subject to.
Yes, assuming it.
I was just paying what they owed. But when I actually sold it, I sold it on the same way, and they actually, I did have a little bit of an override. So their payment to me was actually a couple $100 higher than it was to the bank. Yeah. So I made some money that way for about 1.5 years before they refinanced it.
Good. That's cash flow. Yeah. And kind of to help our listeners, when I teach this, I always break this into 3 kinds of seller finance transactions. Subject twos, and these are my words in my language. All educators use different words. A subject two is when you're just taking over the mortgage.
Right.
And you're not making payments to the sellers that are bigger than the underlying mortgage payment. So you're sort of assuming their loan without assuming it. Then there's a sort of a all-inclusive note and deed where you're actually paying the sellers maybe $1,000 a month on a note and deed with its own terms. And then the underlying mortgage might be $800 a month. So the sellers are actually cash flowing a little bit.
Right. A little override.
And then there's the true seller financing situation where there's no underlying mortgage. And you just do a note and deed with the seller, and the seller becomes the bank.
Yeah, and I've actually done all 3 in different respects. So, do
you have a preference?
Really, it just depends on the situation with the seller. I mean, it's kind of fun when they don't have any underlying mortgage because you can negotiate some crazy terms.
Yeah, you can.
Sometimes, depending on what it is and what their needs are. But yeah, I mean, I'm good with all 3, to be honest.
Perfect.
So, Geoff, was your exit strategy from the get-go to hold it for a year on a lease option and then sell, or did you think you may hold it longer?
That was my exit strategy, yes. I had no intention of really keeping it long-term. I don't know, just the amount of maintenance on single-family homes to me isn't very attractive. They tend to require a lot of maintenance, and, depending on the tenant, they can be pretty picky.
Sure.
I've got tenants even now. I still hold a couple single families that I've had for a while that are paid off, so I just keep them.
Got it.
Sometimes even now the maintenance eats up 2 or 3 months of cash flow. It's like, ugh.
Yeah. So can we go into the numbers just really quickly here to the best of your memory? Obviously, not to the T, like what you picked it up for as far as the acquisition, what you had to put down, what you were cash flowing every month for the year, what you sold it for, kind of profit margins.
Yeah, so this is going to be pretty rough, so just generalizations, but the purchase price was, I believe, $225. It was up in Davis County. It was actually just a little brick rambler, really clean little property.
Nice.
So if I do like single family homes, that's probably the one. Anything with brick on the exterior is usually easier maintenance.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I picked it up for $225. I put $15,000 down.
Very nice.
And then it was actually
Balance on the underlying mortgage was about, if it was
probably around 205,
210
203 or so, something like that. Yeah, the 15 down paid or maybe it was like 197, something like that. Again, I don't remember, but the 15 down gave a little bit to the owner, and then the wholesale fee to the wholesaler. And
gotcha, that included the wholesale.
And then I put the lease option tenant in. I think their payment was like $900 and change, and I was getting $1,150 a month, so I was getting a couple $100 after everything. And I structured it so that they had to take care of any maintenance under $500. If there's something major, I'd come in and take care of it. But for the most part, they did all the maintenance. When they moved out, there was a little bit of a cleanup fee. I think I paid $200 or $300 to get the lawn back in order and get it all cleaned out. And then I think I sold it for $260 or $270, something like that. So
that's great.
I think all in all, after everything's said and done, I made about $50K on it. So
very nice.
Good deal.
Yeah. And you being an agent, you listed it yourself, I'm sure, correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
Perfect.
Awesome.
Very cool.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that initially it was not set up when you bought it. There was no escrow company set up. Explain what an escrow company's job is in a seller financing transaction, and then why you chose to go with the escrow company.
Well, I should also mention that when I sold it, I actually sold it with the seller finance that I mentioned. So I got like $35K down. Then I got the other $10K in about a year and a half after I sold it, once they refinanced. So, I made some money over time. All in total, it was about $50,000, but it came over the period of about 2 years.
Sandwich is what you did.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, which is a great strategy. It's a risky strategy. But he bought on.
Well, I like that strategy because if they don't pay, I can take the property back and do it again.
And then hold the option fee.
Right, exactly. So,
how in contact are you with that buyer, the one who bought it?
Not at all.
Not at all.
They've refinanced. There's no underlying mortgage anymore. There's no reason for me to be in contact with them. I mean, I have contacted them a couple of times because they're on my buyers list. So I've sent out a couple properties they've responded to. But
and why did you opt to go with the escrow company when it wasn't set up?
Oh, that's right. Sorry to circle back around. So, as I mentioned earlier on in the call, one of the payments got lost in between, like the mail and everything.
Were you mailing directly?
I was sending the payment directly to the bank, and it got lost. At least one of them got lost, and it dinged the original seller's record, their credit. And so we wanted a more secure way to make sure that it got paid. So we went through Escrow Services. It's a local Utah company that a lot of people use, and they only charge like $15 a month. It's pretty nominal. And then they directly wire and send payments to all the parties involved. The end buyer when I resold it, we did the same thing. The end buyer would pay into that. I'd get my check for the difference. The underlying mortgage get paid, and everything was dispersed accordingly. So
you also got all of your interest statements, because most companies will generate the yearly tax report, so you know what to report on your taxes.
Exactly. Yeah. So that for the nominal fee of $10 or $15 a month, and the security it brought, it was just a no-brainer.
Yeah. So, do you remember who the underlying bank was?
Oh, I could look. It might take me a few minutes to find.
Is it a major bank or a smaller bank?
I want to say it was a major bank, actually.
Yeah.
I want to say it was like Chase or
Bank of America.
One of the bigger servicers. I honestly, I don't remember.
Because you can actually, go online and just work with the sellers and get their login. And if they have a unique login, they can change their password.
Right.
They share with you, and then you can make payments directly online and avoid escrow specialists or an escrow company altogether.
Yeah, and that's another way. For me though, I don't want to have to go through and make payments. I just want to write one check and let it be done, or I mean, the way I had it set up is my renters was sending the payment directly to escrow specialists, and then they just dispersed it out everywhere.
Right.
So it was just so much more clean for me that I didn't have to worry about anything really. I just get a check from escrow specialist for my portion, and
yeah, you're basically hiring a bookkeeper is when you use an escrow company.
Right. I mean, it's a cheap bookkeeping.
It's a cheap bookkeeping.
Yeah.
Good.
Very cool.
Other lessons you learned on this property or from seller financing were there, other than the escrow and the check? And that's a big deal because their credit got dinged, right?
Yeah, and I mentioned I spent about $300 or $400 on some credit repair services for the original seller that actually took care of it, so they were happy.
They did.
Yeah, so they were able to notify the bank that, hey, this payment got lost, and then we took care of it. So the bank, pulled it back off, and they worked with them. So it ended up with a happy ending. But yeah, from the get-go on these, from now on, I'm just going to set it up like the last two I've done have just been through escrow specialists.
And you can usually set that up at closing.
Exactly, and that's what I've done, and I wouldn't do it any other way now. I mean, for the amount, they don't charge a setup fee. It's just a simple monthly fee, and it's just worth every penny to me. So
good.
So Geoff, last question for me: when you sold it to your buyer, did you list it on the MLS as a self-financed opportunity, or you did? Okay.
I did.
Cool.
Yep.
What was
and I send it out to my buyers too, but it ended up selling through the MLS through that opportunity.
Do you know if you got a good response? Are there a number of sort of agent represented buyers looking?
There are. Yeah, I was actually a little bit overwhelmed with I was glad it was vacant in key box because I could just tell the agent, hey, here's the key box code, go show it.
And a follow-up question. The agent that represented that buyer, how knowledgeable was that agent in a seller finance transaction?
I think they had represented this particular buyer on a couple other deals, but it felt like
an investor buyer.
The buyer. It felt like they knew enough to get it through, but I ended up just communicating directly with the buyer after that. So
okay, perfect.
Very cool.
Awesome.
Geoff, do you have any other questions?
I don't. I'm good.
Yes. Well, Mr. Deering, thank you so very much for your time and sharing the story.
Well, thank you for having me on. It's always a pleasure.
And how can people get in touch with you if they need you?
Oh, I'm easy to find. UtahREA.org.
My home address is this. Stop. Just knock on my door, and I'll have coffee and donuts waiting for you.
I'll just say probably the easiest way is just find me on UtahREA, UtahREIA.org. The president of that organization. So
Geoff is president of the Utah
executive committee on one of the tabs. All my contact information is right there. So
good. UtahREIA.org.
Yep.
Great. Excellent. Awesome. Well, thanks again for
Geoff.
Joining us. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Thanks, Geoff.
If I can ever be of any more assistance, just let me know.
Will do.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And likewise.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
This is Geoff and Yoshi signing off for Deals A to Z, and we'll catch us on our next one.
Sounds great. Thank you so much.